heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 307, covering the week of May 2nd through May 6th, 2022. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. Our YouTube page is an invaluable resource. We have all of our podcasts there, also many of our lectures from our previous summer schools and conferences, and of course our Abbeville U videos, which are these 5 to 6 minute videos on various topics. Great stuff. We have more of those planned to come out this year, so be on the lookout for those. If you're on the YouTube page, of course you'll get an alert when that happens. You can also support the Institute by going to abbevilleinstitute.org. You can click on the Donate tab there. You can give us a monthly donation, one-time donation, or an annual donation. We appreciate all your support. That's how we keep the podcast going, the website going, all of our conferences, our Zoom webinars, all the things we do, our videos. All of that stuff is only made possible by your generous contributions. And we are a 501c3 corporation. So if you want to give us money, you get a tax deduction for it. It's great to the full extent of the law. Now, also, you can support the Institute by rate, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast. Let people know you like it. Share our material around on social media. We're not on Facebook, but of course, if you do share our material there, people do see it. So that's a great way to support the Institute. And you can also click on the Shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. Get our logo and all kinds of cool stuff. When you're at abbevilleinstitute.org, give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook. And of course, that gets you on our email list. You get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday, also any updates and things that we're doing. So it's a great way to keep in contact with us and for us to keep in contact with you through that email list. They can't take that away from us. They can get us off of social media at times, but that is ours to hold forever. So if you want to be in contact with the Institute, make sure you get on that email list. Also, download our free mobile app. Just go to your app store and look for Abbeville Institute. Lots of great ways to support the Institute and keep in contact with us, and we appreciate all of your support. All right, let's talk about the week that was, and we had some really good stuff this past week. One of the major themes, of course, is the role of the South in American conservatism. This is a big topic, and what we see in America today doesn't really have any semblance of Southern conservatism in it. Now, you could say, well, wait a second, McClanahan, what about the, what's going on with the Supreme Court currently? There might be a decision made in June to overturn Roe v. Wade. And of course, the South, if the South was independent, there would be no Roe v. Wade issue, because that wouldn't even be possible in the South. You look at the states that would already have legislation on the books making abortion illegal, and the South would certainly be in that category. In fact, you wouldn't find a state, maybe Virginia, right now, where you would have in Maryland, where you would have abortion legal. But for the most part, you're going to see in the South, social issues are much different than they would be in any other part of the United States. So the South, as an independent federal republic, would have been drastically different than the United States on these social issues currently. So they'll say, what about that? Well, that's great, but when you think about Southern conservatism, it's bigger than that. It's bigger than just social issues. And this is what we often talk about with the Southern tradition. What is the Southern tradition? The Southern tradition is under assault. It's not just social issues, it's economic issues. We know the South was certainly much more suspicious of state capitalism, state finance capitalism, than any other part of the United States. I was going through some old Calhoun speeches and texts the other day, and one of the things he points out, for example, in his exposition, which was written in 1828, was he predicted the populist movement. He predicted the populist movement because he said, look, right now in 1828, you've got Western farmers that are certainly on board with the American system. And they're on board with the American system because they're getting appropriations out of it. The manufacturing states are getting the tariffs, but the farmers are getting appropriations. And what they were getting was internal improvements. And Calhoun said that's fine. They, of course, can go with that. But how long is that going to last before they're abused by the same manufacturing interests that are now abusing the South? He was predicting the 1880s and 1890s when Midwestern and Western populists would rise up against the Northeastern banking class. the Northeastern banking industrial class. Calhoun understood at that time, and he called them out as capitalists. You see, this is the funny thing about the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project says that slavery was the root of capitalism, but you had so many Southern planters identifying New Englanders, New Yorkers, the industrial classes, capitalists. They didn't define themselves that way. They thought they were something else. And so this is really funny because, when Eugene Genovese was alive, no one ever, people would make these claims. He'd swat them down like little no-see-ums, right? They're just gone. Ants, just crush them. But because it's amazing that the point that he dies just several years ago, but from that point forward, you start seeing this rise of the new history of capitalism and how the South was at the root of all this and slavery was at the root of all this. Of course, Genovese would have been, eviscerating these things had he still been alive. But I find that funny that you have this transitionary period. But, Southern conservatism was bigger than that. Of course, it was supremely dedicated to federalism and decentralization. In fact, Calhoun said it in another speech. I'm a conservative because I'm a conservative, I believe in states' rights. And so that core belief of limited central government, real decentralization, enumerated powers, that's certainly something that the South hung on to longer than any other political group. And I say political group because the South voted in blocks, typically. And so that is what's under assault now. And of course, the symbol of all those things generally has been the Confederate flag, Confederate monuments, Southern symbols. And so when you take down the symbols, you take down the core of all that. Taking down John C. Calhoun, as I said in a little video on YouTube, which again, if you're on YouTube, you get those Abbeville U videos. As I said in the little 5-minute video on Calhoun, tearing down Calhoun is tearing down America. It's tearing down America. When you tear down Calhoun, you're tearing down that entire tradition, and people know it. I'll never forget there was an essay written in Time magazine about the state song of Maryland and how it had to go. And of course, why? Because it was defiant. It was dissidence. What they didn't like, what the progressives and the nationalists don't like about Confederate symbols is that they represent a big thumb on the nose, flicking their nose at the general government. You could say something more vulgar, but generally that's what it is. And every now and then you would find in these speeches that people would say this, that they believed this is what these monuments represented. What you won't find in these speeches is any kind of, or very rarely, I should say, is any kind of racial language. And I've made this point on this podcast before because, wait, McClanahan, they say things like Anglo-Saxon civilization in these speeches. They do. They talk about Anglo-Saxon civilization. That wasn't race. When they were talking about race, they would use terms like white supremacy. They would say it. But when they talk about Anglo-Saxon civilization, it's something bigger than that. And I wrote a piece for the Institute, last year I think it was, where I talked about this idea of, Anglo-Saxonism and what that really means. And I pointed out there were a number of Union dedication speeches where they used the term Anglo-Saxon in the speech. So this was common. There was a book on the Titanic written in the 1980s by Robert Ballard, the guy that found the Titanic. And this is in the 1980s, and he said the Titanic was a great expression of Anglo-Saxon civilization. So was Robert Ballard a racist because he said it's Anglo-Saxon civilization? They're talking about a culture, a tradition, a people, not a race. Now, of course, it would be a race, but it wasn't racialist. It was simply saying, the Anglo-Saxon or the Anglo-American tradition goes back to the Magna Carta of 1215, the English Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. That's the Anglo-Saxon American tradition. And so to say these things, fighting for liberty, decentralization, these are things that are important and had been important for a particular type of Europeans for a long period of time. And this is not racialist in terms of, it's just color of skin. It's culture. It's civilization. It's tradition. And so when they wanted to be racist, they would say it. And when they say Anglo-Saxon, that's not what they're doing. So these speeches were often, they had language in it that would say, this statue to Stonewall Jackson, for example, represents our belief that the central government has limited powers. Stonewall Jackson stands for that. Robert E. Lee stands for that. Jefferson Davis stands for that. The common Confederate soldier stands for that, because the inscriptions on the base of the monuments would often say things like that. They stand for that. A government of enumerated or limited power, states' rights. These are things they said, and this is not some lost cause mythology. The other side of that, of course, is people say, well, wait a second. The Confederacy didn't support states' rights, and the Confederacy was against states' rights. They said it. They were against states' rights when the North was nullifying stuff. Well, this is true. The South was opposed to Northern nullification efforts because they considered those nullification efforts to be unconstitutional in what they were doing. The North was nullifying the fugitive slave law, which, of course, is in the Constitution. That was the major difference. Now, you could say there was perhaps some dubious parts of the fugitive slave law. One thing the North was doing that was perfectly constitutional, and this is even Southern Supreme Court justices said this, was non-commandeering. So by saying we're not going to use state resources to capture fugitive slaves, that was perfectly constitutional. The state does not have to use its own resources to enforce federal law. Federal government has to do that. So there's nothing wrong with that. But it was that they were outright nullifying it that the South had a problem with. And now, of course, in 2022, we can say, well, that's not a good idea. We don't support the fugitive slave law, and of course not. We don't support it at all. We don't support slavery. I mean, this is just without question. This is why I find it so odd that anyone has to run around and apologize for something that happened 150 years ago that nobody supports today. It is what it is, and to talk about it is just say, well, I mean, the South supported this, the South didn't support that, there was a legal question here or a legal question there, and you can look back at it and say, well, the South was right about this, or the North was right about this. I mean, these are things that you can do in a historical context, and you shouldn't have to apologize and genuflect for anything. But the real issue, as Paul Gottfried points out on Monday, is the fact that Southerners have abandoned, or I should say conservatives in America have abandoned the South. And by praising the destruction of Confederate monuments and memorials, which conservatives, quote unquote, have done, they're essentially destroying a major part of American conservatism. And Gottfried doesn't understand why Southerners don't rise up against this stuff in ways that are beyond what we're doing. You know, he's said to me, I'm surprised that you don't have a whole bunch of Southerners out there protesting the removal of these monuments. Well, of course you're not going to have that because of the American education system. American kids have been so brainwashed with thinking that everything in the South is bad. Even Southern kids. I've had young Southerners email me and say, I've been told, my friends, everybody just makes fun of the South. It's all just, we live in the South, but we're all told to make fun of it. Well, of course you're going to be told that. Of course that's going to happen. Why not? You're told the South is bad all the time. And so why wouldn't you make fun of these things? This is the real issue. It's something that is highly problematic moving forward for the Southern tradition, but also for American conservatism. Once you break the South, once you break off the South from American conservatism, you're left with nothing. You're not really left with the conservative tradition at all. That's the important point to make here. And I think Gottfried was aware of that. And he wrote this speech. It was a speech he was going to give, but he didn't. And so he published it in Chronicles. He said, this is a speech I was going to make and I didn't make. And so here it is. He was much more conciliatory in his speech rather than this one. And so the major issue really is people like Alan Gelzo, which, of course, on Tuesday, Phil Lee takes apart on his admiration for U.S. Grant. Grant, of course, is an awful president. Grant was one of the worst presidents in American history, and it was recognized as this for years. But conservatives now have tried to revitalize Grant's reputation, to resuscitate Grant, so to speak, because they see Grant as a full expression of Lincolnian nationalism. And not just that, they see Grant as an expression of Reconstruction. And no Straussian has found a Reconstruction bill they don't like. They really do believe the South needed to be remade because it was doing all kinds of horrible things. And of course, for the Straussians, if the Declaration is the key to understanding American government, in the second paragraph where we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, if that's the basis of American government, then you've already lost. And you've already lost because the 1619 Project is going to be more popular on that line than the conservatives, quote unquote, ever will. You see, the 1619 Project, in basing their findings on that line, which they did. If you read the first essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which I don't think a lot of people have actually read it, they just kind of say, oh yeah, the 1619 Project becomes something they talk about. It's just like Calhoun. People don't read Calhoun, they just kind of know Calhoun. And they say, well, Calhoun, defender of slavery, positive good, there you go, that's all you need to know. Just like 1619, they say, well, 1619 is bad. Well, why? They don't actually read it. And so I have some issues with it. But the 1619 Project is based, and Hannah-Jones says it, her father, who was in the military, I believe, and he used to fly the U.S. flag, she couldn't understand it. But of course, he said, look, that flag represents all men are created equal. And if it does that, if that's the case, and of course, the Straussians would say that's true, that's what that represents, then Nicole Hannah-Jones' starting point is the proposition nation, which is Lincoln. Even though the original report was very critical of Lincoln, they've scrubbed that, and they've become much more sympathetic to Lincoln, obviously. But if that's the case, then black Americans have been left out of that. I mean, that's it. I mean, you go from that, and black Americans were left out of that proposition nation, and of course, all of the things that happened over the next 200 years or so, from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which is where that is codified. Not quite 200 years yet, but over the next 170 years, right? All the things that have happened have been a path towards reconciling Lincoln with Jefferson, and then, of course, the meaning of the American singular republic, the American nation. So see, Gelzo and all the conservatives should just become leftists, which is really what they're doing. They should all just become leftists, because if that's the core of America, then America is bad, because we didn't live up to that ever, right? We didn't live up to that. Now, you can make arguments, of course, well, Americans did do X, Y, and Z. The left doesn't care. The left doesn't care because it was never enough, because there was always a violation of that. And you know where the section was that did that? The South. Next week, we've got a piece by Jack Marquardt talking about the new Harvard study that gets into the mea culpa of Harvard, and he points out some pretty interesting things about that. But where is Harvard focusing the money? On Southern institutions, because it's still the South. It's the drag, and so you see the South becomes the boogeyman in everything that happens in America. Everything that's bad is because of the South. But conservatives should take note at some things that the South was doing that you might say, oh, wait a second here, that's pretty important. One of the things we did this week is run a couple of speeches from some Southern members of Congress. The first is a speech by Augustus Octavius Bacon, and A.O. Bacon. A.O. Bacon was in the United States Senate. Now, anytime you publish anything by a Southern congressman, the immediate response from the left, and even some from the right, is going to be, that guy was a racist. And, Bacon was a man of his times. He was a racist, yes. But he made some pretty important speeches, and this one that we ran, we'll probably run more by Bacon, because he was very good on the Constitution. In 1902, this is something a lot of conservatives, again, the military-industrial complex, which is what Gottfried points out. You have military bases, we're going to be pro-military, rah-rah. Well, in 1902, the United States government the Congress decided it was going to reorganize the militia of the United States. They were going to create the National Guard. Now, until this point, we still had state militias. And we still generally have state militias. Though, in 1902, we're going to have a National Guard. And the National Guard was going to nationalize, federalize the American militias by essentially putting them under the control of the United States government. The president was going to have discretion over the National Guard. This is completely different from what it says in the Constitution. And by the way, it's unconstitutional, because the Constitution is very clear about the militia, which is the state militias. The president only has control over the militias when they're in the actual service of the United States. Otherwise, they're under full control of the states. So what the Congress did in 1902 was create this new National Guard, which essentially put all the state militias in a uniform position as a reserve army. A reserve army. Now, This is completely unconstitutional, and Bacon points it out. He says, look, you've just created two classes of citizen soldiers. One is the reserve army. The other is the state militias. And it's confusing because essentially what you've done is say the state militias, which are in the Constitution, are now the reserve army, which puts them under the United States Army. You can't do that. You can't do it at all. That's completely unconstitutional. So a lot of conservatives don't realize this when they run around. They say, I'm pro-military, I'm pro-U.S. military, and I'm going to join the National Guard or join the U.S. Army, whatever it is. What they're actually doing in supporting the quote-unquote National Guard is supporting a completely unconstitutional reserve army of the United States government. The states should have control over all of these things, all of them. Every state, every militia in the United States should be under the control of the United States. And Bacon illustrates this in the speech. It's a very good speech. He points out where the United States Congress was wrong. And he says, look, I'll support a militia. I'll support training the militia. I'll support all of that. Because, of course, that's important. He actually makes a statement that modern gun control advocates would really enjoy when he says that, back in the 18th century, the sporting rifle was, every man knew how to use that. Now we have weapons of war that are different, and people have to be trained in these things. So all of the federal gun rights advocates or gun control advocates would say, oh my gosh, there it is. Here's proof. People knew back then that, assault weapons were different. But Bacon was simply saying, look, yeah, we need to have a trained militia, but it needs to be done at the state level. I'm all for training the militia. I'm for going out there and making sure these people have all the training and proper equipment they need. But we're not going to nationalize it. We're not going to federalize the militia. It's unconstitutional, and everyone in here should vote against it. Of course, they didn't. It was created. But here is the South, the Southern conservative tradition, as Gottfried points out, illustrating that this headlong rush to nationalism is wrong. And you know who was promoting this? You know who was for it? Well, of course, just about everybody. But you had a lot of Northerners that were in favor of the federalization or nationalization of the militias. The second speech we ran was a speech by Oscar Underwood of Alabama. And this particular speech is interesting because it is a speech against the United States government spending money on foreign aid. This is also 1902. What happened is you had a volcanic eruption, and Teddy Roosevelt, who's president, said, look, we need to do something here. He wanted some money to go and send to the French, because this was a French territory that had the volcanic eruption. We need to send some money to them to help these people out. And Underwood heroically stands up and says, look, I'm not against helping people out. We've got charities to do that. We've got all these things. Look, this is horrible, but why are we spending federal taxpayer dollars and sending it to France? Does France not have their own money? Does France not have their own ships? Does France not have their own resources to go help people out? Why are we doing that? Where is it authorized in the Constitution for us to send foreign aid to a country that had a volcanic eruption? I want to know. And you know who else was behind all of this? Generally, if you look at the people that were in favor of it, were all from New England. In fact, during this speech, and this is one that I found very interesting. During this speech, one of the congressmen, this is in the House of Representatives, Underwood would later serve in the Senate, would say, look, you know why we should do this? Because we're a great nation, and we should be the symbol of democracy and liberty and freedom throughout the world. And Underwood responded. He said, now I say in the next place that I do not believe that this is a dignified course for a great nation like this to pursue. I think it would have been very proper and very right for the President of the United States, immediately on hearing the disaster at Martinique, to have telegraphed the American ambassador at Paris to express to the President of the French Republic our sincere sympathy and the great calamity that had happened to his people. Nay, I would go further than that, and if our war vessels were lying off that coast and it was necessary to have ships to save the lives of those people and get them away from that burning lava, I would not have asked Congress, but I would have ordered the vessels in there to take them off that day in an hour. That would have been proper, and that would have been a case of emergency. But when you say that we must express our sympathy to those people by going to the pocket of somebody else and making them pay for our sympathy, I cannot say that I believe that this is the duty of a member of this House. And of course, when you say it's we're a great country. It was essentially the gist of the response to Underwood was, well, we're a fantastic nation. We have this great Constitution, this great liberty tradition, and we need to be spending money to do that. He's saying, why? This is not right. There's a quote from this. It's the title of the piece. What right have we to be generous with the money of our constituents to help a foreign people? What right have we? There's no constitutional right to this. It's unconstitutional. And so Underwood's an interesting individual. He's a progressive. Certainly was a progressive. He's, when Woodrow Wilson's in office, you get Underwood as a very prominent member of the Congress, and you get the Underwood tariff, which was a tariff reduction, but it also sowed the seeds for the income tax, right? I mean, we get the 16th Amendment, and of course, Underwood was certainly in favor of an income tax. This is where the South is interesting, because what they figure out is that, okay, well, if we're going to have this big monstrosity of central government, and we're going to promote business and commerce and finance, let's use it to regulate these things too. And so that was the other part of this. Well, if you're going to have it, and we're going to make sure that all these New Englanders get rich off of this, well, let's take their money. So you could say that's wrong to do, but Southerners are certainly looking at it in a different way, because they were abused by New England for years, and so now they can use the same apparatus to get them back. The last piece of the week is a review by Clyde Wilson on a book collection of poems by Catherine Savage Brossman. So she often goes to our summer schools and reads her poetry. And this is a new book, Arm in Arm. It's published by Mercer University Press in 2022. And she's a very good poet. And Wilson says at the end, he said, I had once the temerity to claim her as a Southern writer. She graciously did not object and has lent her name and fame to the Abbeville Institute. So he puts her in the first rate of Southern writers, people like Robert Penn Warren and Fred Chappell and George Garrett, Wendell Berry, and James Kibler, Jim Kibler. So this is a nice collection of poems, and you should get it. And cover, by the way, I'm a bird lover. The cover is beautiful on the book. I think Mercer did a great job in picking out a photo for the cover, but it's great to have this balance. We often get into politics, but we try to balance that out at the Institute by talking about the other things that the Southern tradition is good for, right? Music and literature and architecture and these type of things that are important in understanding the American tradition, which of course is certainly would not be there without the Southern tradition. So the South is a valuable component of American conservatism. If you get rid of it, you undermine American conservatism. It is a valuable component of American culture. When you get rid of it, American culture is much less interesting and I think much less beautiful. The South certainly has a lot to offer America, and by tearing down symbols, by tearing down the South, by tearing down the Southern tradition, you tear down America. And I think we should constantly be hammering that point. Tearing that down is tearing down America. Now, of course, the left was going to gleefully accept, because they don't like the Southern tradition. They don't like traditional America. And you read some of the things these kooks say, I mean, they certainly are far, far left on so many issues that, I mean, it becomes apparent what their real agenda is. And Gottfried, by the way, pointed that out in his piece. A lot of these people were communists. They were. They wanted a complete communist takeover of the United States, and part of that is cultural, right? That term cultural Marxism has been used a lot. But certainly it's a leveling of all cultures, not just economic leveling, but communism at its core is an egalitarian equity ideology. And when you do that, there's no culture that's better, there's no civilization that's better, there's no people that's better, there's nothing that's better, right? There's no economy, there's nothing's better. Everything is the same. And if it's not the same, of course, you have to eliminate something that promotes anything that might be viewed as something being superior or better to somebody or something else. Well, I mean, excellence is something that Americans often strive to be. And every great civilization does that. You can go all the way back in Western civilization in particular. There would be no Western civilization without a quest for excellence, without Athens and Sparta wanting to be excellent and better than the Persians, for example. So, hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.